Hello, everybody. How's it going? All right. Hello, Facebook world. Hello, Zoom world. I'm Jen Stojkovic. I hope you guys are having a good day so far. It's Thursday, which means it's almost the weekend. Welcome to our latest edition of Scaling Social Impact. Scaling Social Impact is a series that SF.citi started last year in 2020, where we are bringing together social impact and community relations leaders to talk about how on earth you continue to be engaged with your city, be engaged with your community in this very, very precarious and strange remote world. So I'm really excited about today's conversation because we have three amazing leaders that are going to be joining us today. We have Casey Aden-Wansbury, who will be joining from Instacart. We have Joan Hanawi joining from Lyft, as well as our board member from SF.citi, Jim Green, joining from Salesforce, of course. I'm going to do a couple quick housekeeping notes for everybody, and then we're going to bring up our first speaker. So first off, today's format. The best way to learn about how companies are engaging in this remote world, hearing a little bit of a deep dive in their projects, is to do fireside chats. So we are going to be bringing up each of the speakers individually. We'll bring up Casey first, followed by Joan, and then Jim. And then at the end, all three speakers are going to be here to answer all of your questions. So if you have any questions throughout today's conversation, please drop them below in the Q&A tab. I feel like at this point, you should all be Zoom aficionados. So everybody should be fairly familiar with how to use the Q&A. So please, if you have any questions throughout today's conversation, use the Q&A tab. We will get to as many questions as we can. All right, I've got to do my quick plug here. So first off, today is recording. So if you miss any of these amazing nuggets of wisdom, don't worry, this entire conversation will be recorded so that you can rewatch it till your heart's content, and of course, share with everybody else in the space. The last thing I'm going to note is you should use the hashtag scaling social impact and tag SF.citi on Twitter to hear more about your thoughts on today's conversation. All right. With that being said, and you'll see right there in the chat below, Jackie just dropped in, there's the hashtag again and our handle. With that being said, let's bring up our very first speaker, Casey. Let's bring you on stage. Welcome to the stage.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here. I appreciate the invitation and look forward to this conversation. This is an important topic, and look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists as well.
Awesome. So the last time Casey and I spoke, before she started this amazing new role at Instacart. So Casey, you're the vice president of policy at Instacart right now?
I am. Yep. Policy and government affairs.
Awesome. Could you just tell folks just a little bit quickly about what that means, what your role entails, and then we can get into the Instacart story of what you've been working on?
Sure. So I lead all of Instacart's work in the government affairs and public policy space. My team, I have a team of regional policy managers that manage, state and local government as well as federal government relationships throughout North America. Instacart is in Canada and the United States. I have a team of community engagement professionals that work to build relationships with the community, with third parties and others, and have been very involved in the work that we're going to talk about today. And then we also work on, engaging in and solving the public policy issues that are most important to Instacart. So have a team of folks dedicated to working through those policy issues, understanding them, and engaging in policy conversations.
So you must have been extremely busy in a year of a pandemic. I must say, my parents up in Canada, they're in their 60s. They went from never knowing what the word Instacart was to using it religiously. So it must have been quite a year for you.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think the experience that you talk about is one that a lot of people have had who, maybe hadn't used it yet or had used it only occasionally. I think, it became people's relationship with grocery delivery and with Instacart in particular became much different once the pandemic started. But we are very proud to have been, ready to handle this. And, we worked hard, our team worked hard to scale up quickly to make sure that we could meet demand and make sure that we able to serve everyone. We serve about 85% of the United States and Canada right now with our service. And yeah, we're just glad to be able to help. And we appreciate our shoppers who are out there shopping every day, bringing groceries to people who need them.
So what does civic engagement mean in the Instacart context?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think, like like much of the tech industry, are among the things that are kind of core to the value of what our value proposition is as a company is that we are, we're essentially democratizing access to services and economic opportunities for people. And so I think that feeling and that spirit is something that's very close to our company and our founders and sort of what we do every day. In our context, in our business context, that means our mission is to provide access to food to people. So I think that that's sort of our main business purpose. But as we thought about the sort of concept of civic engagement as we approach this election year, especially this unusual election year, thinking about how can we use those platforms and those channels to provide access to information about voting was something that really came to the fore. And so a lot of what we focused on in the past year was that on the civic engagement side was thinking about how can we use our platform and our channels. We're a multi-sided marketplace. Our reach extends beyond, extends to shoppers, retailers that we work with, customers across the country, as well as employees. And so we wanted to use our platform and that network to really engage and provide information about voting. And, I'd say that's sort of the primary focus last year. I will say, as a related note, that the pandemic itself, of course, there are a lot of other civic impacts that the pandemic has had. And for us, a cause that we've been very close to all along is food insecurity. And certainly the economic crisis that's brought up by the pandemic has deepened that food insecurity throughout the country. That's something that's very much of concern to us. And so we've also been engaged, deepened our engagement in this past year in that area.
So I think one of the things that is really interesting with a lot of our members, with apps in particular, is that it's such a great spot to meet people where they're at. Yeah. Do you have any numbers around, how you were able to reach folks with any of your civic engagement work?
Yes. Let's see. So the main sort of hub the main way that we engaged on civic engagement this year was to create essentially a civic action center, a platform.
Yep.
We worked with partner Phone to Action to set up a page where we would be able to provide information to people on where their polling place was, what voter registration deadlines were, how they could vote, and information about candidates and how to learn more about what they were going to be voting on. So that hub was sort of the focus of our work, and we worked beyond that to we worked to make sure that our employee base across the country knew about it, had access to it, really promoted it. We also used our channels of communication to our customers and our shoppers throughout the country to drive them to the Action Center and remind them to vote, remind them to register. We ended up with about 46,000 visits to the site in just about 6 weeks. And we launched the Civic Center. We launched, I believe, on voter registration day, so weeks ahead of the election. So this was our first effort in the area, but I think we felt like it was a successful way of doing this, and we look forward to building on that in the next cycle.
So first off, as somebody also in the policy space, of course, all of us community relations folks are like, oh my gosh, getting more people to turn out and vote and getting people voter information through your own portal is really interesting. Did you dive deep beyond just federal? Did it specify based on the location?
Yeah, absolutely. Essentially, the system we set up was the information wasn't all housed on our site. It was essentially, we were a conduit, right? And so cool. Based on your zip code, you were able to look up more detail on what you would be voting on in your area. So yeah, it was throughout the country.
That's amazing. So what's the next cycle going to look like? Obviously, we don't have a big election this year, but I'm sure you guys are ramping up for what you can do 2.0.
Yeah, I think I think building on that is something that we'll work on. I think as you mentioned that I just joined Instacart about 6 months ago. Before that, I was at Airbnb, and I know Airbnb has done a lot of work in this area too.
Yeah.
And I think in thinking as a company, tech company, thinking about the ways in which you can engage, I think the best solutions end up coming from like looking at your product and your users and what the best match is for that interface. So for example, I'll contrast Airbnb and Instacart in that way. For Airbnb, customers are, booking vacations a couple of times a year, right? And so people are coming infrequently to the site, but they are coming on occasion. The company did a very robust voter education plan this past year as well. But I think as we thought about when I was there, ways in which you might be able to expand upon, reaching people, if you know who's booking trips on election day, for example, and so you have, you can think about who might be needing to register or get an absentee ballot, things like that. So there was conversation around like, what might that look like long term? For us at Instacart, people are grocery shopping every week. So we have really frequent access to customers. Our shoppers are shopping all the time. They're looking at the app all the time. So I think for us, really thinking about, that population is constantly interacting with us on a regular basis. And so thinking about how we can really build on what we did in the 2020 cycle to sort of, engage further with, whether it's through the app or other channels of communication that we have with that population. That's probably where we'll head there. And I should mention the other sort of aspect of civic engagement that we thought was important to do. So that really is about communicating with our community. I think the other thing we wanted to do was to try and show some kind of leadership and stand with other executives, other corporate executives, to really make sure that we stood behind democracy and civic discourse. Yep. And so the other angle that we focused on was joining with a group called the Civic Alliance, which these other companies I'm on here with may well be members of as well. So it's a number of CEOs and leading Fortune 500 companies that have come together to essentially make sure that we're speaking with a unified voice to support democracy, to support safe and fair elections, and making sure that people are voting and votes are getting counted. So we did that this summer as well, understanding that this was likely to be a volatile time this past year, as it certainly turned out to be. We thought it was important to really make that stand as well as a company.
Okay, so I've got to ask, did you get any pushback, both from customers internally?
We really didn't actually. I'm happy to say, I think, in both cases, those are, pretty nonpartisan things, generally speaking, usually.
Generally.
And so, generally speaking, I think, our community really welcomed those things both.
Awesome. Do you think that, so let me back up for a second. So Instacart in the world of tech companies is a fairly younger company, so to speak, compared to some of the other folks that are both in today's call and in the greater ecosystem. Do you think the fact that you are a younger company made it easier to be more nimble in your civic engagement? How do you think that influences your culture around how you engage with your community?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, the ability to be nimble is an advantage that we have, and I think that's right. I think so. Being able to to move quickly and not have to go through a structure that you might have at a larger company makes sense. I think the other thing that we benefit from is, as we are newer, and I would consider our 2020 engagement as our first step. Where we had the opportunity to kind of start fresh and look at a design and think about what are the areas in which we think we can make an impact. What ways are going to be most impactful to engage for our stakeholders? So we had an opportunity to really kind of set that up rather than have to sort of go backward. I'd say the disadvantages are, of course, that we don't have that infrastructure in place, and so we're really building from scratch, and that comes with some challenges too.
So for folks that are joining today's call, that are either we have a lot of folks that join from the nonprofit industry, of course, that are looking to engage with companies like yourself, as well as many people that are in community relations, government relations, social impact. What are some pieces of advice that you could give that help make these partnerships successful? That'll be my first question. The second one being, if you are a leader at a tech company that has no money to put towards this, do you have any advice for projects you can do?
Sure. I think in terms of successful partnerships, it goes back a little bit to what I touched on earlier, which is that I do think, that the most successful, from what I've seen, the most successful sort of areas of social impact and civic engagement are when companies sort of take a look at what their own company core values are.
Yeah.
And then when they take a look at like who their main stakeholders are, who are the communities in which they're already engaged as a company. And then, think about what is their actual product or platform and how can that engage. And I know you're talking to Lyft soon. I'm sure, for example, being able to offer rides and have that be part of your business is a different thing than delivery or than renting a house or other types of things. So thinking about what works for your platform, I think, is important. And if you're a nonprofit looking to engage, I do think one thing that I've always tried to do in helping the companies I've worked for navigate where to engage, what topics to focus on, is to think about that combination of what your business does and where your company's core values are. So again, for us, the concern about food insecurity is very close to our business and to the values of why we all are here and have joined the company. And so that's an area that makes a lot of sense for us to really engage in, beyond civic participation, which I think to us, the democratization of access to information is that second step.
Yeah.
So I think if you're looking for a company to partner with and you're at a nonprofit, thinking about what companies might have that natural affiliation or affinity. Airbnb, I'll just plug as another example, is very deeply involved in refugee work and disaster response work, which makes a lot of sense given that providing shelter is core to what they're doing. So I think finding that synergy is something that really helps. And then in terms of no money, that's a good question. I think I would then look back to think about what are your other tools and ways of communication. For example, if you're able to communicate with customers, or you're able to communicate with other audiences, other stakeholders and partners, thinking about how you might engage that community or your employee base. Working, a lot of what we've focused on as well is really making sure that we're, engaging our employee community in our food insecurity work as well as our civic engagement work. So that's another way to really harness, the power of communication and people, even if you're not able to devote financial resources to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the app and what you're able to do with a active audience, especially one that is shopping for groceries all the time or getting lifts all the time, when we bring up Joan, we can talk about, that's worth a lot. That value is worth a lot. So, well, thank you, Casey, for this great conversation. We are going to say adieu to Casey for just a little bit. Just as a reminder to everyone, drop your questions below in the Q&A tab if you have any questions throughout today's conversation. And Joan Hanawi, please welcome up to the stage.
Hey, Jennifer.
Hello. How is it going?
Going well over here. How about you?
I'm doing pretty well, but I must say you are winning with the background. I've just got this plain wall, and you have just this is fun. What is going down the sides of the door?
That is, ironically, it's from my last pre-pandemic trip. We went to a wedding in India, and this was one of the favors we got. Yep.
Oh, I love it. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Joan, welcome to the stage. I would love for you to just explain a little bit to the audience about what your work at Lyft and what you do in social impact is.
Definitely. And Casey, I feel like I have to thank Casey for doing half my intro for me, talking about the work that we do with discounted and free rides. So I'm on the social impact team here at Lyft, and I lead a lot of the Lyft Up programming, which is kind of our comprehensive effort to meet transportation needs and to provide support for transportation access and equity.
Great. Okay. So I know that this past year was not the first time that Lyft has engaged civically, and you guys have been doing something, some different areas of focus for the last few years, but I'd love to hear about what this past year of civic engagement has looked like for the company.
Yeah, I think for us, civic engagement means a lot of things. And so for us, it really kind of comes down to participating in your local communities. And with the rise of the pandemic and all the needs that emerged from COVID-19, I think we really thought about what type of, what can we do to support the communities and who are the people that are making our communities work right now? So a lot of the efforts that we launched in 2020 were centered around supporting frontline and essential workers when it came to how do we strengthen and fortify those community relationships. So I think in about April of last year, we announced our critical workforce programs that offered free and discounted scooter rides and bike share memberships to frontline workers, essential workers, healthcare transit workers, to just help them get around, since that was such a need during the pandemic. And it was, I mean, by the end of the year, it was crazy to look at the numbers. Like, I think we'd given over 900,000 free rides on bikes and scooters, and then had also leveraged our rideshare side of the house to do to support over 200,000 healthcare workers through the American Federation of Teachers. So it was just really incredible to see how much need there was, and then also how we could use almost every single mode on Lyft, on the Lyft platform, to help meet that need.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like, I was going to ask, has the pandemic shifted how you do civic engagement? But very clearly it did, and it just, you guys were firing on all cylinders.
Definitely. I think that if anything, the pandemic just amplified the kind of core strategy and the core philosophy we have around impact and around civic engagement. For us, I really think that one of the silver linings of crises is you see people reaching out, you see people building those bonds that maybe didn't exist beforehand. And for us, we were able to build on Lyft Up, which is, as I mentioned, is kind of our comprehensive effort to provide transportation access to those who need it most. And that Lyft Up program covers an array of programs, which include things like jobs access, grocery access. So as you can tell, that those are also two of the biggest needs during the pandemic. So it's not necessarily that we pivoted necessarily, but I think we doubled down and we really dug into how do we make this model more accessible for more people, just knowing that there are even more needs now.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have a story that you could share with the audience about what one of your civic engagement initiatives look like, especially if there's a partnership that you've done with a nonprofit in particular?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I'll just go deeper into the Jobs Access Program, which we had originally launched our Jobs Access Program back in 2019. And then going into 2020, before COVID-19 hit, we had already heard a lot of feedback about making this more accessible. So originally the model is if someone who is in need of a ride to a job interview, a job training, or their first few weeks of work until they get their first paycheck, we wanted to make that possible. And so we had an array of nonprofit partners, and these nonprofit partners had ride credits that they would give out to those individuals in need. But overwhelmingly, the feedback that we heard was, but what if I'm not connected to that nonprofit? How do I just sign up for help in general? So we were already in the middle of revamping that. And then in 2020, when the pandemic hit, those unemployment numbers just shot up, and we saw an even bigger need. And so we were actually able to launch a jobs access hub for the first time. And what I loved about that was it actually gave people direct ways to either give or get help. So on the site, if you're in a position where you're able to give, there are ways to donate to our nonprofit partners, which include United Way and Goodwill. And then if you were in a position of needing support, you were able to kind of go through a sign up form to understand who serves you, and if you're in one of the areas where we operate this program, who serves in what region. And United Way and Goodwill have been incredible partners on the ground. They know their communities best. They are those local footprints in every city. And I just remember hearing this incredible story from Goodwill from someone named Lenny, and he had been in a Goodwill training program, had just gotten a job after kind of going through the whole program, but just didn't have a way to get there. And so because we had this program, because he was able to kind of access the resources we had built out, he was able to then successfully go ahead and get that job, which was, I think, something that was really important since it hit right at the beginning of the pandemic.
So one question that we get from many, many folks that we work with in the nonprofit space is, what do you look for when you're looking for a nonprofit partner? You mentioned, of course, the fact that they have a local footprint all over is a huge advantage for both Goodwill and United Way. But is there any other tips or things that you would like to share with the nonprofits joining today?
Yeah, I think that one of the big things I'll come back to is use cases. And I also really liked where Casey was headed and with her last question around just knowing what your core product or your core asset is. So what that means, like when we're talking about the Lyft ecosystem, is for us, we really look at as transportation as like our superpower. It's a little kitschy and a little nerdy, but it's really how we think about what we have to offer the world. And so we are always thinking about where is transportation a pain point, and what can we do to remove that pain point? So that's what creates the foundation for our programs like Jobs Access, programs like Grocery Access, which is how do you get people to food, people to the grocery store. There's an array of other programs like the Bike Share Access programs, disaster response, how do you get people to places they need to go in times of need. And through all of that, we look for partners who are working in those spaces and have the operational expertise, but might have a gap around transportation as well. So for United Way and Goodwill, for example, with Jobs Access, they were already doing work to provide training support, resume reviews, skills training, but they didn't have the transportation support to offer their job seekers to actually get to that final step of the job interview or to get to that first day of work. So that's where we really did a lot of vetting to understand like who's in a position where they actually like this is a perfect match where we both have something the other person needs. And then second, does that nonprofit partner have the scale and the ability to operationalize, because we're really relying them to be boots on the ground for us.
So do these partnerships vary from region to region? Do you have the Lyft Up Access Alliance and Lyft Up Jobs in every city where you operate?
So Lyft Up, the Lyft Up programs do vary per region. And again, that's really based off of our nonprofit's capacity. So we are often we want to make sure that we are being good partners and not, creating more work in areas where they don't have that support, but we really let the nonprofits lead and let us know where they feel like they have a strong presence and they're able to support. But I also heard you mention the Access Alliance, which is another big civic engagement initiative that we launched in 2020, which was around and kind of in direct response to a lot of the acts of systemic racism and racial injustice that we saw in 2020. So for years, you've heard me talk about the use cases, but these use cases have always been kind of specially crafted so that they can serve multiple communities, knowing that when you're talking about access and equity, communities of color are just historically disproportionately affected. So the Access Alliance was a way of bringing a number of our key foundational racial equity partners, groups like NAACP, National Urban League, Black Women's Roundtable, and convening them to create almost an advisory council to help us continue to guide and continue to fortify our existing racial equity work and racial equity strategies built into our programs, and to continue to advise. But if you're thinking about a jobs access program, what does that mean for communities of color, for the Black community, for the brown community? How does that look different compared to just something that would be created for the general population? And how do we get smarter there? So I think that was something that was really important. And so in that way, the Access Alliance kind of is embedded into all of our work. But of course, our partners, if you're referring to who's specifically part of it, they do have their local headquarters, their local footprints, et cetera. But they really act as like an advisory board for us.
Awesome. So this is a lot of very robust, high level stuff that you guys have been able to put together over the last few years. But in addition to that, you also are deploying folks to help get rides to vaccination sites. And so it seems that the social impact approach at Lyft is very much both methodical. There's some backbone work that you do year round, but you guys also have the ability to just immediately jump into things probably similar to what Casey was able to do with Instacart. I'm curious, how do you deploy those programs so quickly? How do you train your drivers so quickly on these new initiatives, and any insights you can share from that?
It's a great question, and probably one that we're honestly still asking sometimes internally here at Lyft.
I
think we've worked really hard on refining our rapid response protocols and also that allow us to move quickly. And also it's definitely something that's still a work in progress. But I think one of the common themes at Lyft is just how important social impact is across the company. So one thing that I'm grateful for is that while I'm on the social impact team and I do drive a lot of this work, the social impact work overall is not constrained to our team. Like, we have so many cross-functional partners and we really leverage almost every arm of the business. So at this point, we've really built a good rhythm for how we work together. And as I mentioned earlier, that lens of where does our superpower of transportation fit in really helps guide where and how we help, so that we don't get distracted by things that just don't make sense for us, or where we're not the best fit or the best partner. And instead we hone in on like, what do we have to offer, and can we step in here? And for something like vaccine access, we had been hearing repeatedly that the gap of getting someone from their scheduling their appointment at home and then to that actual in-person location to get the shot in their arm, like that was where the gap was, especially with 2 doses needed for many of the vaccines. So that's something where toward the end of 2020, as we started to see that there was real movement on the vaccine front and there was something available, that's where we got our rapid response teams together and built that program out. So very much so, still in the thick of it now, but excited to see those rides start going out.
That's incredible. I think that there's probably going to be a key theme that we talk about today, and that's that you need to have it as part of your employee culture, right? Social impact can't operate on an island. It has to be part of the ethos of everything that you do as a team. Do you have any pieces of advice that you would like to give to folks perhaps that are joining from the tech side, that they are just eating up everything you're saying, they're eating up everything that Casey's saying, but perhaps they don't have very much of a budget or they don't have that same kind of buy-in? Any advice on how they can navigate this type of social impact work at their companies?
Yeah, I think for us, one of the things that you've heard me say repeatedly is that the cross-functional nature of our work. And I think that's because when we think about building programs, when we think about measurement of programs as well, we really look at 6 core stakeholder groups, and that spans way beyond social impact. So we're constantly, for us at Lyft, of course, we're looking at riders, drivers, employees, business clients, investors, and policymakers. So kind of taking that multi-pronged approach and really kind of accounting for the different points of view that come in when you consider those different stakeholders, I think is what allows us to build that robust type of programming. And that programming, then there's also levers that you can pull to make sure that it's tailored for the needs that emerge. So something like vaccines, we're really working closely with our policy teams and our healthcare teams to understand how do we safely and comfortably support the needs there without getting in the way, and with making sure that this is actually something that is a true support and a true solution for the community.
Yeah, I love the hedgehog principle, do the one thing that you do best. And it seems to obviously be a big part of the success that you've had at Lyft and Instacart, and I'm sure Salesforce as well. With that being said, Joan, it was great chatting and learning more about Lyft's work. We're going to bring Joan back up at the end of today's conversation. So we're going to say goodbye to Joan for now. Just a reminder to everyone, as I bring Jim Green to the stage, our final speaker, we have a Q&A box down there. I know lots of you sent over questions ahead of time, but I would love for you to throw your questions in the box. Jim, hello, how are you?
I'm well, Jen, how are you doing?
Well, just getting ready for the weekend. Although I don't know if weekends really exist too much in this setting.
Yes, they do.
Yeah? Okay, well, I'm glad that you've got those. Are you guys doing the time boxing that Microsoft's doing, where you have the fake commutes and everything built in?
I don't know that we're doing that, but I just enjoy the weekend. So I try and make sure to take advantage of them.
Awesome. All right. Well, we're very fortunate to have Jim joining as our last speaker today to talk about community relations work and everything that Salesforce has been doing. Jim, do you mind just telling everyone who are not familiar with your work a little bit about what you cover at Salesforce?
Yeah, sure. And thanks again for having me, Jen. And it's great to be with Casey and Joan as the other panelists. So I've been at Salesforce for 6.5 years now as a senior vice president for government affairs, public policy, and have added public affairs to that over the last couple of years. So anytime the company is dealing with government stakeholders, whether they're elected officials, regulators, or folks around that atmosphere, it is me and my team that goes in on behalf of the company and works on different policy issues, both related to our business and related to equality issues.
Would you mind clarifying for folks? I know a lot of people wonder, what is the difference between public affairs and government affairs?
Sure. So government affairs largely is seen as the literal interaction between, let's say, myself and a mayor, to take one example. So an elected official, and if a legislative body, either at the state level or the federal level, is looking at a piece of legislation, it is the work of government affairs to go in and either advocate on behalf of that piece of legislation, against, or try and amend it into a final piece of legislation that works. Public affairs is more broadly speaking about how do you work with the external environment around things that are important to you in the company. So things around, in the equality lens, that would be, what are we doing around the issue of homelessness in San Francisco? Or what are we doing around workforce development? Or how are we helping out during the pandemic in many ways?
So for everybody that's joining from the nonprofit sector, that was my quick little tip to all of you, just to understand what you're navigating when it comes to finding the right folks at different tech companies and what their different scopes of work are. All right, so now that we've got that out of the way, Jim, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what Salesforce's approach to civic engagement is, what that looks like. You are, of course, the biggest company by far that is joining today, so a little bit different than that scrappy startup approach. Let's hear more about it.
Well, we try and stay scrappy, but we have achieved an amount of success in the 21 years that we've been around. But civic
Wow.
engagement is part of what our founder, Mark Benioff, has been talking about for a long time, which is an adherence to stakeholder theory, right? Where shareholders are part of that stakeholder community, your customers are, your employees are, your partners in the communities in which you operate. And within that last bucket, civic engagement is core to that. And we have a very robust employee base that wants to be involved in the communities in which they live and work in. And so it's just a natural extension of stakeholder theory that we feel we adhere to, and largely I believe the corporate sector is doing the same thing over the past number of years. Certainly, Instacart and Lyft are two great examples of that. But you even have big associations like the Business Roundtable who are talking about stakeholder theory in a way today that they did not do 5-10 years ago.
So could you give us an example? Let's look at 2020 in particular. What were some of the key areas that Salesforce honed in on for civic engagement?
Well, it was a whopper of a year, wasn't it? One unlike any that I think any of us have experienced before. I'll give two examples of things that we did. One was almost a year ago. It was the beginning of the pandemic, and it was a time when PPE became into focus for the country and for the globe, and it was a real issue. And of course, it was hard to get here in the United States. We at Salesforce jumped in as we are wont to do at different points wherever there is a crisis. So because of partnerships and relationships we had with potential suppliers of PPE, we were able to quickly mobilize and have our head of business strategy work directly with a few companies in Asia to secure some PPE. And then my team and the legal team got involved from a governance perspective around where would we actually provide this personal protective equipment to hospitals and then obviously to governments. And really was a super cross-functional team that came together that didn't exist before. So the head of business development at Salesforce didn't think that he was ever going to find himself in the PPE business, but it's what the times called for. And it was really, really neat to see the company all align behind this really important first step during the pandemic. Another example would be the work we did around the elections. So we've always encouraged civic participation. And one way to do that, of course, is to vote. We've done that for the past few cycles. We also are a part of the Civic Alliance and have partnered with Turbo Vote in the past. This past year, we gave Election Day off as a holiday for the first time for employees. But maybe the thing I'm most proud of is our partnership with Power the Polls, in which we asked of our employee base to become poll workers because we had heard that had become an issue in different spots around the country because of the pandemic. And we had over 700 Salesforce employees become poll workers on Election Day. So that was really neat.
All right, there's a lot to unpack there. I'm going to go to the first example first. So you were able to harness the fact that you had big clients. I'm assuming that's how you had so many of these relationships to get this PPE produced and connected to the folks that need it.
Yeah, it feels like forever ago, doesn't it? But it was just last March and April. If we can remember back, it was a real issue to get PPE in amounts. And so, yeah, we had a few strategic partners who had relationships with suppliers where we were able to quickly procure and then bring into the United States and push out to a few hospital systems, SF here locally, and a few places in New York as well. And then we'd follow the virus when Detroit had a big outbreak and New Orleans had a big outbreak. We started working with the state governments in both Michigan and Louisiana and tried to help out there. It was wild. I mean, we were literally making it up as we went. But it was an example of Salesforce just jumping in.
So I'm curious, did you have any sort of pushback or any sort of friction between your teams when it came to, these are our huge clients, these are folks that we have very big contracts with, and we don't want to connect these two things? Or was there any sort of internal misalignment when it came to that? Or did everyone just say, no, of course, like let's do this thing?
It's the right question, and it's the latter. And that was really heartening to see, because again,
Great.
when you're in a crisis, you really want everyone to pull together. And it was an example of that very thing across oceans and across continents. It was one of my most favorite moments professionally over the last couple decades.
Yeah, absolutely. When we did the Race to Respond in April, we were speaking with some folks where Amazon was using some of their planes to be flying that PPE in, overnight. It wasn't really making the news, but they were just, all right, we've got the transportation, let's just start moving it.
Well, there was a crisis, and we needed to react to it. And so, there are a number of corporate examples who did great work during that time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's amazing. So the second piece, talking more about how you were able to turn some of your employees out into the poll workers and just kind of the get out the vote, has been something that Salesforce has done for many, many years. So how is that received by your employees? Were they just, everyone obviously was very excited at the opportunity? Do you get any sort of internal pushback there? How did you navigate being able to pass those types of policies?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would start by saying all of our work was nonpartisan, and communication is key. And I think my fellow panelists would say the same thing. And internal communications, it's really explaining the what, the why, and the how you're doing something, and what you aren't doing. So in our case, all of our work geared around elections was around encouraging participation. We were not doing any sort of persuasion. So it's a really key element to begin with, because you do have employees who are very diverse from a political spectrum, many spectrums, but on the political spectrum. And we do live in volatile times. And so you just have to be very concise and precise in your communications internally. But because over 700 poll workers did volunteer, and that was across the country in offices in Atlanta and San Francisco and places like Dallas and Boston. It was very well received. But I would say that communication is key for all of this.
And in terms of creating those internal stakeholder groups, it sounds like one of the very key things that have been talked about by all three of you speakers today has been, you need to align all the different folks across the organization to work on these types of programs. So you've got biz dev people that are suddenly working with, GR folks, and I'm sure there's other people that get thrown in the mix. HR, of course, is involved here too. Do you have any pieces of advice for folks that are joining from other tech companies or other organizations where perhaps they are not as big as Salesforce, but they are just getting started with this work and they want to get internal buy-in?
Yeah, I had no idea. So before I was at Salesforce, I was in politics during campaigns, and I was in the nonprofit world, both as a staffer and as a founder. I did not appreciate the amount of internal alignment that goes into working inside a corporate setting. And obviously that gets more complex the bigger you get. But I'll give one example of another internal alignment that happened last year. Is last summer, after the tragic death and killing of George Floyd, the company, Salesforce, and so many other companies stood up a racial equity task force.
Yep.
For it to actually work in practice, we knew we had to have multiple organizations within the company buy in and work towards this. So we came up with what for us was our 4 Ps, which is people. What are we doing within our own house? And so that was our employee success, which is essentially HR. It was procurement, and that was within our finance and procurement team. It was philanthropy, so all of Salesforce.org aligned behind it. And then it was policy, was the 4th P, which was, of course, the GA team. And it was through 6 months of rigorous work where there was weekly meetings to make sure there was that consistent alignment on those 4 Ps, where we now have stood up quite a number of things. And I would just say never underestimate the value, because it does take time, and people do want to move very fast. And sometimes that makes you want to think you can go it alone. But always, I would say, putting in that extra time to understand the different organizations internally will pay massive dividends over the mid to long term.
Yeah, it's all fun and games and full speed ahead until the comms team gets a hold of things. So
That's right.
I think we've all been there. Yeah, awesome. So the last question I'm going to ask, and then we'll bring our other speakers back up on stage, is what is next for civic engagement for Salesforce? What are you excited about?
I'm excited. I'll start by saying that because we are 20, we were founded in 99. So I guess we're coming on 22 years here. But Mark really encourages us to have a beginner's mind. And for that means many different things to different people, but you can come to it with a blank canvas in many ways. Look what you've done that's been successful in the past and repeat that, but then add on to it. And so we'll certainly continue our work with the Civic Alliance, and we'll certainly continue our work trying to register more voters who are employees. We registered 1,200 Salesforce employees domestically in 2020. So we'll definitely continue to do that. We'll continue our speaker series where we bring in elected officials or candidates for office in some of our hubs for different events. But one other thing that's on my mind specifically right now, and I think Casey touched on this a bit earlier, is what is the corporate world's responsibility at creating better civil discourse? So we've done a fair amount internally at bringing in different speakers who have different opinions on a range of issues, and our employees have really enjoyed those settings. We're able to control those settings because they're internal. I'm thinking about, so it's a little bit easier. So it gets a little scarier if you want to bring that external, given the volatility of the environment we find ourselves in. But I think it's really important. So I'm not sure how that manifests itself just quite yet, but it's on the mind. And I think you'll see Salesforce engage on that front over the next couple of years.
Well, that's very exciting. Casey, Joan, let's welcome you both back up to the stage. And just curious on Jim's comment there about how you can move forward with engaging externally and bringing those types of folks into the space. Have Lyft or Instacart weighed in on that? Are you guys going to enter that territory as well?
I mean, I like what Jim was saying about kind of bringing in people with diverse speakers and diverse perspectives. I think that was definitely our attempt and our intent with the Access Alliance, and really bringing together these partners and also bringing in new partners. So not just the ones that we worked with before. I mean, even today, before I joined this, we had an internal fireside chat about police brutality and policing efforts kind of across the country, and just bringing in, local electeds and representatives. So I think that, Jim, it's spot on. Sometimes here in the Bay Area, it's important that we bring in those diverse perspectives, and we bring in folks who don't necessarily agree with us, just so we can push each other and really understand what the core needs are, what the core asks of the community are.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think thinking about that exchange among all of your stakeholders is something that we're thinking about a lot. In terms of bringing people in to talk to our employees, but for us, we've also spent quite a lot of time thinking about how to engage our shoppers and our customers. I think I touched on our food insecurity work earlier, but this past year we launched for the first time what we called Give from the Cart, which was a partnership with Feeding America, where we invited consumers to donate the value of their last grocery cart on Instacart to help go to local food banks through Feeding America. And we ended up through that effort, and we did that in the spring, and then we did a virtual food drive in the fall. About 3 million meals we were able to donate through that. And so I think, and that's our community, that's our employees participating, but it's also our customers and shoppers. And so I think that's, as we think about the future, we're trying to think about how do we bring our employees to the table, but how do we also bring those other communities to the table? And so far, what we've seen is there is a real interest in demand in doing that, in participating among our customers and among our shoppers and retail partners.
All right. So we have some awesome questions that have come through, both through our Eventbrite as well as the Q&A below. So just a reminder, we're going to get to as many questions as we can. If you have questions, drop them below. We have a few minutes left with these three great speakers. Here's a great question. What types of KPIs can you use? So key performance indicators can you use to measure social impact and civic engagement, especially in a remote world? I'm going to just give that to the floor. Does anyone have any thoughts there? It's a good question.
It's a great question. I can try to take a pass at it. I would say that, let me answer that question in a slightly horizontal way. So we really look at outputs and outcomes. So we don't necessarily set like specific KPIs that would kind of govern all of our programs, but we really focus on like what are the immediate outputs, and we also look at that really as short term. So what the things that are easily measurable for us, it's rides. So like how many rides we had been given, how many people were served, things that can just be easily counted as part of your program management. But what we really want to focus on are the outcomes. So for example, you've heard me talk a lot about our Jobs Access program. So I personally am excited by the fact that we've done, I think, 30,000 rides to date through our Jobs Access program, but I'm actually more interested in, okay, how many people who took that ride actually got a job and retained it? And how many people like year over year, what does that look like? And so that just takes time. Outcomes are a lot longer term. So we're in the middle of setting up a lot of research programs. And that's where I think it's a little bit hard to answer the KPI question directly, because it should be program specific, in my opinion, which is kind of where we bring in the outputs and outcomes perspective on that.
Yeah, I agree with everything Joan has said. And I think in terms of both, there are ways to measure what you are committing and putting on the table as a company, but then you also need to be keeping track of how that's actually having an impact and whether it's having an impact. I think, a couple things that come to mind as guiding principles for us. One is, I think working with nonprofit partners is a way to help make sure that you're in close touch on that feedback. And if with Feeding America we're working with, or if it's the Civic Alliance, what kind of impact are they seeing, and are they, is what we're doing and how we're showing up moving the needle on the goal that they have as our partner in this space. So that's one area. And the other, I would say, that we think a lot about is how to make sure that when we do jump into something and invest in it, that we're in it for the long term, because I think, as Joan was saying, like some of the stuff it takes time, and so I think it's important to not just measure immediate impact of that action, but to really think about this in terms of, if you're going to invest in this area, whether it's civil discourse or job creation or hunger, how are you kind of engaging over the long term so that you can kind of build towards bigger results?
Do you have anything you want to add, Jim? If not, I've got another question for you.
I can't say it any better than Joan and Casey did there. So let's go to the next.
Mic drop. Okay. Jim, can you define the difference between social impact and civic impact? We definitely used both terms a lot in today's conversation.
That's actually a tough one. And I'm interested in the other two panelists' answer to this too. I mean, civic impact for me is from a control what you can control, which for me in my role is our employee base at Salesforce. And so that is, I mean, we have a very lofty goal of having 100% of our domestic employee base vote by 2024.
Nice.
So that's on the mind. That would be a civic impact. We have, when Mark created the company back in 1999, he came up with the 1-1-1 model that a lot of folks know at this point, right? But 1% of our equity, 1% of our product, and then 1% of our employee time goes back into volunteerism. So on that last one, the volunteerism, we get 7 paid days off a year to volunteer, and we want to have 100% success rate at that for our employee base as well. And now that we're a company of 57,000 employees times 7 days, that actually does have the potential for real social impact. So those are a couple areas for both civic and social, but I'm interested in both Joan and Casey's answer to that as well.
So your Australian office already reached that goal then?
They're close.
All right, Joan or Casey?
I don't know. I mean, I agree with Jim. It's kind of a hard distinction insofar as I think it can probably be, diced up a number of ways. One way, I think you could think of it would be, the civic engagement maybe aiming more towards participation in in the electoral process, participation in sort of, you know, a little bit more in the public policy space, or the you know, just the engagement of individuals, whether it's employees or other stakeholders, engagement in the you know, in sort of the governing process in some way, versus social impact being a little bit more about you know, a little bit more focused on the sort of humanitarian side of engaging with your community more broadly, maybe not as strictly defined as civic impact. That said, I think you could use those things interchangeably, and I'm sure many companies do.
Yeah, I feel like Jim did in the last question. I couldn't have said it better than what these two said. I do agree a lot with what Casey was saying around it being potentially like civic being a little bit more tied to the acts of local government. So I think in 2020, we had done work around the census as well as around voting. But for us at Lyft, social impact goes beyond voting. So that's why you've also heard me talk about a lot of our other programs in the sphere of civic and social impact. So I agree that a lot of times they are interchangeable.
All right. Well, that concludes our difficult questions of the day. I'm going to ask two final wrap-up questions. I'll go Jim, Joan, Casey. All right. Jim, best burrito in the Bay Area?
You think that's an easy one? I will go. I will go with Rico Taco, because I'm biased. That's on Lakeshore Avenue, and I live in Oakland and Crocker Highlands, and I'm trying to frequent it as much as possible, especially during these times. They do a killer carne asada burrito.
Okay, Joan?
I also live in Oakland, but I have to say anything in the Mission in San Francisco, you can't beat a Mission burrito.
Casey?
Definitely La Taqueria, La Tac in the Mission. That is by far my favorite. I will stand in line for a burrito there anytime.
All right, we'll go reverse. Casey, tell us what you are most looking forward to doing in the Bay Area, tradition or landmark to visit when we are able to go back in person.
That is also an easy one for me. I will be attending the very first concert that they have at the Fillmore again. I really miss live music. I miss concerts. And, you know, I think the Fillmore was one of the last places I went before we all shut down. And hopefully it'll be one of the first places I go when we open up.
Fantastic. Joan?
I feel like this is a bit of a lame answer, but all my favorite places to go are outside. So I actually feel like I've been really enjoying this, because there's Joaquin Miller on the Redwood Regional Park in Oakland. And so there's just so many wonderful hiking trails that those are the first places I would go. And I'm still going, thankfully, today.
You're one of those people that's thriving in the pandemic. Jim?
Well, I'll rep Oakland some more because I'm a native of Oakland as well, and I grew up going to A's baseball games with the Bash brothers and Ricky Henderson and all that, and so I can't wait to go to the ballpark.
Okay. Well, with that, thank you everybody for spending your lunch with us in today's conversation. Thank you, Jim, Joan, Casey. It has been a treat, and I can't wait to do this in person next.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Jim and Joan.
Thank you
all. Great to be with you guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Until next time.